Good evening, friends. Tonight we'll drift into a slow and gentle journey through ancient Greece and the mysterious world of Dionysus, the god of wine, celebration, and hidden madness. Dim your lights, settle under your blanket, let the noise of the day fade away, and if this calm journey helps you relax, feel free to tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right. We'll wander through vineyards heavy with purple grapes, listen to the soft footsteps of ancient festivals, and discover the quiet moments between myth and history. These are stories of transformation, of wine slowly fermenting in clay jars, of theatre masks carved by patient hands, and of a god who understood both joy and sorrow. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and tell me what time it is in your city right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, whether you're watching at midnight in New York or during a quiet afternoon in Tokyo. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's begin our journey with the wine god himself. You find yourself walking through an ancient Greek hillside on a warm evening, when the air smells of wild herbs and distant cooking fires. The sun hangs low, casting long shadows between olive trees, and somewhere in the distance, you hear the faint sound of singing. This is where our story begins, with a god who was born twice and never quite belonged anywhere. Dionysus wasn't like the other Greek gods. While Zeus threw thunderbolts from Mount Olympus and Athena planned battles with perfect strategy, Dionysus wandered the earth with dirty feet and wine stains on his clothes. He was the god who chose to live among humans, to sleep under their roofs, to share their meals. But there was something unsettling about his presence, something that made people's hearts race even when he spoke softly. Imagine you're sitting in a small Greek village around 800 BC, maybe helping to prepare the evening meal. The women are grinding barley in stone querns, the sound steady and rhythmic. Children play with clay toys near the doorway. Everything feels normal, peaceful, routine. Then a stranger appears at the edge of your village. He's young but ageless, beautiful but somehow wild. His dark hair is tangled with grape leaves, and his eyes seem to hold secrets. This stranger carries a staff topped with a pine cone, wrapped in ivy that never seems to wither. When he walks, you notice his feet are stained purple, as if he's been treading grapes for hours. The village dogs don't bark at him. Instead, they approach with tails wagging, as if they recognize something ancient and familiar. The children stop playing and stare, not with fear, but with the kind of fascination you might feel watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. The stranger introduces himself simply. "I am Dionysus," he says, and his voice carries the weight of distant mountains and deep forests. "I bring gifts." From a leather bag, he produces something the villagers have never seen before. Clusters of dark purple grapes, each one perfect, each one heavy with juice that seems to glow in the fading light. But here's what made Dionysus different from other gods bringing gifts to mortals. He didn't just hand over his presents and disappear in a flash of divine light. Instead, he stayed. He showed the villagers how to crush the grapes, how to let the juice ferment in clay jars buried in cool earth. He taught them to wait, because the best things take time. Day after day he would check the jars, listening to the soft bubbling sound that meant the wine was coming alive. You watch him during these quiet weeks. In the morning, he helps the farmers tend their regular crops, his hands gentle with the olive saplings and barley shoots. At midday, when the sun is too hot for work, he sits in the shade with the old men, listening to their stories about local spirits and family histories. His questions are never rushed. "Tell me about the spring where you draw water," he might say. "Has it always tasted the same?" These conversations could last for hours. The children begin following him everywhere. Not because he performs miracles or shows off his divine powers, but because he notices things they notice. He'll stop to examine an interesting beetle crossing the path, or point out how the light changes colour when it filters through grape leaves. "Look," he tells a little girl, "the shadow of this vine looks exactly like a dancing person." And it does. But you start to notice other things too. The way people's eyes grow brighter when Dionysus is around. The way conversations become more intense, more honest. A farmer admits he's been watering down the olive oil he sells. A mother confesses she sometimes feels trapped by her daily routine. Secrets spill out like wine from an overturned cup, and nobody seems embarrassed by these revelations. When the wine is finally ready, Dionysus calls the whole village together. The tasting happens at sunset. with everyone sitting in a circle on woven mats. The first sip is ceremonial, passed in a simple clay cup from person to person. You taste it and understand immediately why this drink might be considered divine. It's not just the sweetness or the warmth that spreads through your chest. It's the way it makes you feel connected, to the earth where the grapes grew, to the hands that picked them, to the people sharing this moment with you. As the evening progresses and more wine is shared, something beautiful and strange begins to happen. The village baker, who has never sung in public, begins humming an old lullaby her grandmother taught her. The blacksmith, usually quiet and serious, starts telling jokes that make everyone laugh until their sides hurt. Two families who have been feuding over a property line suddenly find themselves discussing their disagreement like reasonable people, finding a compromise that satisfies everyone. But you also notice the edge of wildness that wine brings. Voices grow louder, gestures more dramatic. Someone suggests they should dance, though there's no formal festival planned. Another person begins weaving flowers into crowns, claiming the gods have instructed them to do so. A young man climbs onto a table and recites poetry he's improvising on the spot, verses about birds and rivers and love that make no logical sense but somehow feel profound. Dionysus watches all of this with a slight smile. He drinks less wine than anyone else, you notice, but his presence seems to amplify everyone else's experience. When people look at him, they see something that makes them feel more alive, more willing to take risks, more eager to break the small rules that usually govern their behaviour. A grandmother starts dancing with the energy of a teenager. A shy young woman begins flirting boldly with the carpenter's son. It's as if the wine has given everyone permission to become more themselves than they usually dare to be. This is the gift and the danger of Dionysus all wrapped together. He shows people their hidden selves, the parts they keep locked away during ordinary daylight hours. Under his influence, the boundaries between appropriate and inappropriate, between wisdom and folly, between sacred and profane, begin to blur. You see why some people would welcome this god with open arms, and others would fear him with every fibre of their being. As the night grows deeper, some villagers excuse themselves and return to their homes, claiming they need to rise early for work. But others stay, drawn by something they can't quite name. They build a small fire and continue talking, sharing stories that grow stranger and more personal as the hours pass. Someone begins drumming on an overturned pot. Others clap along or stamp their feet. The rhythm is hypnotic, ancient, something that seems to bypass the mind and speak directly to the body. Dionysus stands and begins to move to the rhythm. His dance isn't formal or structured like the ritual dances performed at official festivals. It's loose, improvisational, full of gestures that seem to come from some deep, instinctive place. Others join him, following his movements but adding their own interpretations. An elderly man dances with his walking stick held high like a staff. A young mother dances while nursing her baby, rocking and swaying in patterns that seem both maternal and mystical. You find yourself drawn into the movement too. Your feet know this rhythm even though you've never heard it before. Your arms rise and fall in gestures that feel both completely natural and utterly foreign. Time becomes elastic. Minutes might be hours, or hours might be minutes. The fire crackles, the drums continue, and you lose track of where your heartbeat ends and the music begins. This is the madness of Dionysus, not the frightening insanity of broken minds, but something more like divine intoxication. It's the madness of feeling completely present in your body, completely connected to the people around you, completely open to experiences you can't control or predict. It's terrifying and exhilarating at the same time, like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the wind pull at your clothes. When dawn finally arrives, you're exhausted but oddly refreshed. The fire has burned down to embers. Most of the dancers have fallen asleep where they sat, curled up like cats in the morning sun. Dionysus is gone, vanished as quietly as he appeared, but the empty wine jars and the grape stains on everyone's clothes prove that last night really happened. Over the following days, you notice how the experience has changed the village in small but permanent ways. People are more likely to laugh at themselves when they make mistakes. Conversations include more personal details, more honest emotions. The evening meals last longer, with more singing and storytelling. It's as if Dionysus left behind a piece of his wildness, a reminder that life doesn't always have to be so controlled and predictable. But you also understand why some people might reject this gift. There's something unsettling about a god who reveals hidden truths, who encourages people to ignore social boundaries, who makes ecstasy and madness feel like the same thing. Not everyone wants to dance until dawn or share their deeper secrets with neighbours or discover parts of themselves they didn't know existed. As you drift off to sleep thinking about this strange god and his followers, you might wonder, what would it feel like to encounter someone who could show you aspects of yourself you've never acknowledged? What parts of your own nature do you keep carefully contained? And what might happen if you let them loose for just one night? That question about hidden aspects of ourselves leads us to a longer journey, one that took Dionysus far from those familiar Greek villages and into lands where nobody had ever heard his name. You find yourself following dusty caravan routes that stretch beyond the horizon, heading toward places where the air shimmers with heat and unfamiliar spices scent the wind. Picture yourself travelling with a small group of merchants around 500 BC, your sandals worn thin from walking, your water skin warm against your hip. You've been on the road for weeks, moving slowly eastward through territories that change like chapters in a strange book. First, the familiar hills of Greece gave way to the coastlands of Asia Minor, where Greek colonies dot the shoreline like scattered coins. But now you're moving deeper into Asia, into regions where the local gods have different names and different faces. The temples you pass are built in architectural styles that make your eyes work harder to understand their proportions. The people speak languages that sound like music played on unfamiliar instruments. Their clothes are dyed with colours you've never seen before, deep purples and brilliant yellows that seem to glow even in an ordinary daylight. Your travelling companions are nervous. These are practical men, traders who deal in olive oil and pottery, silver jewellery and woolen cloth. They know how to bargain, how to assess quality with a quick glance, how to sleep safely in foreign cities, but they've heard disturbing rumours from other merchants returning from the east. Stories about a young man who claims to be a Greek god, who's been causing upheavals in cities from Lydia to India. The stories vary depending on who's telling them, but certain details appear in every version. This young man travels with a group of followers, mostly women, who behave in ways that local authorities find alarming. They dance in public spaces, drink wine in broad daylight, and seem to ignore most social conventions about proper behaviour. Some people say they can perform miracles. Others claim they're dangerous troublemakers who should be arrested before they corrupt the local population. You first encounter evidence of this mysterious figure in a small trading town near the coast of Lydia. The marketplace feels different from others you've visited, livelier somehow, with more laughter and louder conversations. Vendors hawk their wares with unusual enthusiasm. Customers linger at stalls, chatting with strangers instead of completing their business quickly and moving on. An elderly woman selling dried figs offers you a sample, and then tells you, unprompted, about the most interesting customer she met last week. A young man with eyes like deep water, she says, who paid me not just for figs but for stories about how we dry them. He wanted to know everything, what time of year we pick them, how long they take to cure, whether we sing while we work. Then he taught me a new song, something about fruit and patience and waiting for sweetness to develop. You notice similar changes in other people you meet. The innkeeper who serves you dinner talks more than necessary, describing not just the food but the memories it evokes. How this particular recipe came from his grandmother, how the spices remind him of his childhood, how cooking connects him to generations of his family who prepared the same dishes in the same way. Normally, such personal revelations would seem inappropriate from a stranger serving paying customers. But tonight, his openness feels natural, even welcome. As you continue eastward, these encounters with the mysterious god's influence become more frequent and more intense. In one mountain village, you find the entire population engaged in what appears to be an impromptu festival. There's no temple celebration scheduled according to the local calendar, no harvest festival or seasonal observance. Yet people have decorated their doorways with flowering vines, brought out their best clothes, and gathered in the main square to share food and drink. A village elder explains, somewhat sheepishly, that a young stranger visited 3 days ago and somehow convinced everyone they deserved to celebrate. He didn't perform any miracles, the elder insists. He just asked us about our daily routines, our worries, our small pleasures. By the time he left, we realised we hadn't properly celebrated anything in months. We work, we sleep, we worry about crops and weather and money. When did we stop taking time to enjoy what we have? The festival atmosphere is infectious, but also slightly unsettling. Children who should be helping with chores are instead making flower crowns and teaching each other elaborate games. Adults who should be tending their fields are sitting in circles sharing stories and jokes, passing around cups of wine that materialize from nobody knows where. The normal rhythm of productive activity has been replaced by something more spontaneous and less predictable. But you also observe how the celebration brings out different aspects of familiar social dynamics. A merchant who's usually harsh with his servants treats them like family members, sharing his meal and asking about their comfort. A woman known for her sharp tongue and critical nature becomes generous with compliments, finding beauty in things she'd normally ignore. The village's most respected matron, typically formal and distant, sits on the ground with teenagers, laughing at jokes that would ordinarily scandalize her. When you finally encounter Dionysus himself, the meeting happens so casually you almost miss its significance. You're watering your horses at a stream when a young man approaches, leading a donkey loaded with wineskins and clay jars. He nods politely and begins watering his animal beside yours. For several minutes, you work in comfortable silence, the way travellers do when they recognise each other as people who understand the routines of the road. "Good water here," he comments eventually, cupping some in his hands to drink. "Clean and cold even in summer. The local people told me their great-grandfathers chose this spot for their village specifically because of this spring." His voice carries no particular authority or mystique. He sounds like any knowledgeable traveller sharing useful information. Only gradually do you begin to notice the details that mark him as extraordinary. His clothes are well made but dusty from travel, suggesting both means and genuine wandering rather than ceremonial appearances. His hands are stained purple, not just on the fingertips but deeply into the palms and around the nails, indicating extensive work with grapes or wine. Most tellingly, his pack animals carry no trade goods of the usual sort, no pottery or metalwork or textiles, just containers designed for fermented beverages. "I'm Dionysus," he says simply when you ask his name. He doesn't announce his divinity or list his accomplishments. The introduction carries the same casual tone he used to comment on the water quality. But something in your chest responds to the name, a recognition that comes from some deeper place than rational thought. You've heard this name in prayers and stories, but meeting the person behind it feels surprisingly ordinary. Over the course of that afternoon, as you share a simple meal by the stream, Dionysus tells you about his journey eastward. He speaks of it not as a divine mission, but as a learning experience. Every place teaches different lessons about celebration and community, he explains. Greeks celebrate with wine and theatrical performances, but I've seen people in India who achieve similar states through elaborate dances that last for days. In Persia, they create extraordinary gardens where the act of contemplating beauty becomes its own form of worship. He describes encounters with local gods and religious traditions, not with the competitive attitude you might expect. Instead of trying to replace existing beliefs, he seems genuinely interested in understanding how different cultures approach the universal human need for transcendence and community connection. The elephant-headed god in India serves some of the same functions I do, he muses. He removes obstacles, brings joy, helps people overcome their inhibitions. We have much to learn from each other. As evening approaches, other travellers arrive at the stream. Merchants, pilgrims, a family relocating to a distant city. Without any formal invitation, they join your small camp. Dionysus shares his wine generously, but more importantly, he creates an atmosphere where strangers feel comfortable sharing food, stories, and temporary companionship. By nightfall, your simple roadside rest has become an impromptu celebration involving a dozen people from different cultures and backgrounds. The conversations that emerge around the campfire reveal the deeper purpose of Dionysus's eastern journey. Through patient questioning and careful listening, he's learning how different societies balance individual expression with collective harmony. Some cultures encourage emotional display and personal revelation. Others prize restraint and collective decision-making. His challenge is to understand how his gifts of liberation and celebration can enrich different social structures without destroying what makes them functional. You watch him navigate these cultural differences with remarkable sensitivity. When a Persian merchant begins sharing personal stories that make a conservative Lydian trader uncomfortable, Dionysus gently redirects the conversation towards safer territory. Shared experiences of travel, observations about weather patterns, amusing encounters with difficult customers. He never shuts down self-expression, but he also never forces it on people who aren't ready. Later that night, as the campfire burns low and most travellers settle into their bedrolls, you have a chance for private conversation with the god. He seems more thoughtful than the stories about him suggest, more interested in understanding than in being worshipped. The hardest part of this journey, he admits, is learning when not to interfere. Sometimes people need celebration and liberation, but sometimes they need structure and predictability. Wisdom lies in knowing the difference. When morning comes, the travellers disperse in different directions, but something has changed in each of them. The Persian merchant mentions plans to incorporate some Greek winemaking techniques into his business. The Lydian trader talks about organising better entertainment for his customers. The relocating family discusses ways to maintain celebration and joy, even while adapting to a new home. Dionysus has planted seeds that will grow in ways he may never see. As you part ways with the god, continuing on your separate journeys, you carry with you a new understanding of cultural exchange and adaptation. Dionysus's eastward wandering wasn't about conquest or conversion. It was about learning how universal human needs, for joy, community, transcendence, celebration, express themselves differently in different contexts, and how these expressions can enrich each other without losing their essential character. Years later, when you hear stories about mystery cults that blend Greek and Eastern elements, about winemaking techniques that incorporate spices from distant lands, about festivals that combine traditional Greek theatrical performances with dance styles learned in Asia, you'll remember that quiet afternoon by the stream when a god showed you that true wisdom often looks like patient curiosity rather than dramatic revelation. The herbs were gathered by his youngest daughter, how the bread tastes different when baked with wood from olive trees rather than oak. It's as if everyone has become more interested in the stories behind ordinary things. 3 days later, you catch your first glimpse of Dionysus himself. Your merchant group has stopped to rest during the hottest part of the day, finding shade under some ancient oak trees near a spring. The water is cool and sweet, and you're refilling your skins when you hear singing in the distance, not the kind of formal hymns you might hear at a religious festival, but something more spontaneous and joyful. A group of about 20 people emerges from the trees, moving at the relaxed pace of those who aren't trying to reach any particular destination by any particular time. At their centre walks a young man who must be Dionysus, though he looks more like a well-travelled merchant than a divine being. His hair is longer than most Greeks wear it, braided with small flowers and leaves that change depending on the local flora. His feet are bare, dusty, and clearly accustomed to long distances. But it's his companions who capture your attention. Most are women of various ages, dressed in clothes that seem to come from a dozen different cultures. One wears a Greek chiton dyed deep red, another a flowing robe that might be Persian, a third something that looks Egyptian in its cut and decoration. They move together like a family, though they clearly come from different places and backgrounds. Dionysus approaches your merchant leader and asks permission to share the spring. His manners are perfect, respectful without being servile. When permission is granted, his group settles nearby, but not so close as to intrude on your privacy. You watch them from the corner of your eye as they drink, wash their faces and hands, and share food from their packs. What strikes you most is how comfortable they seem with each other. There's none of the tension you often see in travelling groups. No arguments about who should carry what. No complaints about the pace or the route. They share their food without measuring portions, pass water skins without keeping track of who drinks how much. When someone's sandal strap breaks, 3 people immediately offer to help repair it. One of your merchant companions, braver than the rest, approaches Dionysus and asks about the road ahead. Are there bandits in the mountain passes? Which cities offer the best exchange rates for silver? How are foreign merchants treated in the larger towns? These are the practical questions that keep traders alive and profitable. Dionysus answers each question thoughtfully, providing not just the information requested, but context that proves he really knows these territories. He describes not just which routes are safe, but why certain areas breed more bandits than others, how drought years push desperate farmers toward outlawry, how political instability creates power vacuums that criminals exploit. His knowledge comes not from maps or second-hand reports, but from having walked these roads and talked with these people. As the conversation continues, you learn that Dionysus has been travelling eastward for several years, moving slowly from city to city, region to region. His mission, if it can be called that, seems to involve sharing his knowledge of winemaking and celebrating the rituals that accompany it. But he's not trying to replace local customs or impose Greek practices on foreign cultures. Instead, he's learning how different peoples relate to intoxication, celebration, and the loosening of social boundaries. In Phrygian territories, he discovered that the local mother goddess Cybele, was already associated with ecstatic rituals and wild dancing. Rather than competing with her worship, Dionysus found ways to honour both traditions simultaneously. His followers learned Phrygian drums and cymbals, while Cybele's priests incorporated wine into their ceremonies. The result was something new, neither purely Greek nor purely Phrygian, but a hybrid that satisfied both cultures. Further east, in regions where Persian influence was strong, Dionysus encountered Zoroastrian ideas about the cosmic battle between light and darkness, order and chaos. These concepts fascinated him because his own nature embodied similar contradictions. He brought both joy and madness, both creative inspiration and destructive abandon. Persian followers began seeing him as a deity who helped people navigate the necessary tensions between structure and spontaneity. What becomes clear as you listen to these stories is that Dionysus's journey eastward is changing him as much as he's changing the places he visits. Each culture he encounters adds new layers to his identity, new ways of understanding what it means to be a god of transformation. The winemaking techniques he learns in Cappadocia influence how he teaches viticulture in Mesopotamia. The musical instruments he discovers in Armenia become part of the soundtrack for celebrations in Syria. His followers reflect this cultural blending. The woman in Persian robes turns out to be a former priestess of Ahura Mazda, who found in Dionysus a way to honour both divine light and divine wildness. The one dressed like an Egyptian joined the group after learning that her goddess Hathor and the Greek Dionysus shared interests in music, dancing, and the loosening of inhibitions. Each person brings their own religious background, their own cultural practices, their own language and customs. Yet somehow this diversity creates harmony rather than confusion. During their evening meal, you watch them blend their traditions seamlessly. Prayers are offered in multiple languages to multiple deities. Food is prepared using techniques from various cultures, but shared according to customs that seem to emerge naturally from the group dynamic. Someone plays a Greek lyre while another keeps rhythm on Persian drums, and the result sounds like music that might have existed for centuries. As night falls, Dionysus invites your merchant group to share wine with his followers. The vintage comes from somewhere in Lydia, made using methods that combine Greek fermentation techniques with local grape varieties and Persian storage methods. It tastes unlike any wine you've tried before, familiar enough to be recognisably wine, exotic enough to remind you that you're far from home. The conversation that follows over this shared wine becomes something you'll remember for years. People talk about their travels, their families, their reasons for choosing nomadic life over settled existence. But these aren't just casual travel stories. Something about Dionysus's presence, or maybe the wine, or perhaps the combination of different cultural perspectives, makes everyone more thoughtful, more willing to share meaningful experiences rather than surface anecdotes. A Lydian merchant describes how learning to make cheese from goat's milk taught him patience in ways that no philosophy lesson ever could. One of Dionysus's followers, originally from a Greek colony on the Black Sea, explains how Persian poetry helped her understand that homesickness could be transformed into a deeper appreciation for beauty. Your own merchant leader, usually taciturn and focused solely on profit margins, finds himself talking about how the colours of sunrise look different in every country he's visited. You realise that this is what Dionysus offers people, not just wine and celebration, but a way of being present to experience that allows ordinary moments to reveal deeper significance. The techniques he's learned from various cultures aren't just about making better wine or organising better festivals. They're about paying attention, about remaining open to the unexpected, about finding connections between seemingly unrelated things. As the evening progresses, someone produces a set of dice made from polished bone, and a gambling game begins. But even this becomes something more than mere entertainment. The bets placed aren't for money or goods, but for stories. A lost throw means you have to share a memory you've never told anyone before. A winning combination earns you the right to ask any question of any person in the group. The stories that emerge from this game are remarkable not for their drama or excitement, but for their intimacy and honesty. People talk about childhood fears, about moments of unexpected kindness from strangers, about times when they understood something important about themselves or the world. The questions asked are similarly thoughtful, not invasive or gossipy, but genuinely curious about the inner lives of fellow travellers. Through this game, you learn that Dionysus's journey eastward began as a kind of exile. Other Greek gods had questioned his legitimacy, his right to claim a place on Mount Olympus. Rather than fighting for acceptance, he chose to prove his divinity through experience, by walking among mortals and learning what they truly needed from their gods. Every culture he's encountered has taught him something new about the relationship between divine and human, between transcendence and everyday life. But you also sense that this journey is approaching some kind of culmination. Dionysus speaks of India as his ultimate destination, a place where he expects to find teachings that will complete his education in the mysteries of transformation. His followers seem to understand that their group will probably dissolve once that goal is reached, with each person carrying what they've learned back to their own homeland. This gives the present moment a bittersweet quality. Everyone knows they're participating in something temporary, something that exists only because these particular people happen to meet at this particular time in history. The wine they're sharing will never taste exactly the same again, because it comes not just from grapes and fermentation, but from this specific combination of voices, stories, and perspectives. When you finally settle down to sleep under the oak trees, your mind is full of questions about journeys and destinations, about what it means to be transformed by travel, about whether the most important discoveries happen when we're actively seeking them, or when we're simply open to whatever we encounter along the way. Those questions about transformation and discovery become more concrete when you consider how something as simple as fermented grape juice could change an entire civilization. You find yourself transported back to a time before wine existed, when grapes were just another fruit that people ate fresh or dried for winter storage, and nobody imagined the magic that could happen when their juice was left alone in the right conditions. Picture yourself in a small farming settlement in ancient Greece, perhaps around 1200 BC, during the harvest season when everyone works from dawn to dusk gathering the year's crops. Your hands are stained purple from picking grapes, and the air is sweet with the smell of fruit that's perfectly ripe. Some grapes go into baskets for immediate eating, others are laid out on reed mats to dry into raisins. It's exhausting work, but satisfying in the way that seasonal labour can be when everyone participates, and the results feed the community through winter. You're working alongside an old woman named Semele, who has been tending grapevines longer than anyone can remember. Her grandmother taught her which varieties grow best in different soils, how to prune the vines without damaging next year's growth, when to harvest by tasting the fruit rather than simply looking at the calendar. She moves through the vineyard with the easy confidence of someone who understands plants at an instinctive level. But this year, something unusual happens. A section of the harvest that was stored in large clay jars gets forgotten during a busy period when everyone is focused on olive picking. When someone finally remembers to check those jars several weeks later, the grapes inside have changed completely. Instead of fresh fruit or even the expected spoiled mush, they find a liquid that smells intriguingly complex, sweet but also sharp, fruity but also earthy. The first person to taste this liquid experiences something unprecedented. The flavour is unlike anything they've encountered before, somehow more intense than grapes but also more subtle. More importantly, after drinking a cup of this mysterious juice, they feel different. Not sick, not confused, but somehow more alive, more aware of colours and sounds and sensations. Their usual shyness around other people seems to evaporate, replaced by a warm feeling of connection and goodwill. Word spreads quickly through the small community. People gather around the clay jars, taking turns tasting this accidental discovery, trying to understand what has happened and whether it might be dangerous. Semele, with her deep knowledge of plant lore, examines the liquid carefully. She can see that fermentation has occurred, the same process that turns milk into cheese or grain into bread, but applied to grape juice in a way nobody has tried before. What fascinates you most is watching how people react to their first taste of wine. The village elder, usually stern and focused on practical matters, begins laughing at jokes that wouldn't normally amuse him. Two neighbours who have been feuding over water rights suddenly find themselves discussing their disagreement calmly, looking for solutions rather than trying to prove who's right. A young mother, exhausted from caring for 3 small children, rediscovers her own personality beneath the layers of constant responsibility. But the effects aren't uniform or predictable. Some people become more talkative, others more contemplative. One man starts composing poetry about the olive trees, while his brother becomes fascinated by the geometric patterns in woven baskets. A teenage girl who is usually awkward and self-conscious begins dancing with graceful confidence, while her best friend sits quietly, apparently having profound thoughts about the nature of existence. Semele watches all of this with the keen attention of someone trying to understand a new natural phenomenon. She notices that the amount consumed matters. A small cup produces gentle relaxation and enhanced sociability, while larger quantities lead to more dramatic changes in behaviour and perception. She observes that individual reactions vary based not just on physical size and tolerance, but on personality, mood, and even the time of day. Over the following days, she begins experimenting with intentional wine production. Using her knowledge of plant processing and fermentation, she tries different grape varieties, different storage containers, different time periods. Some attempts produce vinegar, others create something that tastes harsh and unpleasant. But gradually, through careful observation and adjustment, she develops techniques that consistently yield the smooth, complex liquid that has such interesting effects on people. What emerges is not just a new beverage, but a new understanding of the relationship between humans and plants. Wine seems to occupy a middle ground between food and medicine, between the natural and the supernatural. It comes from ordinary grapes, but the transformation process creates something that can alter human consciousness in ways that feel almost magical. You spend hours with Semele, learning the subtle signs that indicate successful fermentation. The way the liquid changes colour from bright purple to deeper, more complex hues. The shift in aroma from simple fruitiness to layers of scent that include flowers, herbs, and earth. The sound of gentle bubbling that indicates the invisible process is working correctly. The timing that determines whether the final product will be sweet or dry, strong or mild. But winemaking turns out to involve more than just technical knowledge. The process requires patience, faith, and acceptance of variables beyond human control. Weather affects the grapes before harvest. Temperature influences fermentation speed. Even factors like the clay composition of storage jars or the altitude of the vineyard seem to impact the final results. Making wine means participating in a collaboration between human intention and natural forces. As Semele's winemaking skills improve, word spreads to other communities. People travel considerable distances to taste this new creation and learn the techniques for producing it themselves. But what they discover is that winemaking can't simply be reduced to a set of instructions. Each region's grapes taste different because of local soil and climate. Each family's wine develops its own character based on their specific methods and materials. This leads to the development of what might be called the first wine culture. Communities begin specializing in different styles and techniques, trading not just the finished product but knowledge about cultivation and processing. Festivals develop around harvest time, combining the practical work of grape picking with social celebrations that feature wine tasting and comparison. You participate in one of these early harvest festivals, held in a valley where several villages have brought their best wines to share and evaluate. The event lasts for 3 days, combining serious technical discussions about fermentation methods with more relaxed social activities that take advantage of wine's ability to dissolve social barriers and encourage friendly interaction. During the day, people examine each other's wines with the focused attention of craftspeople comparing techniques. They discuss the relationship between grape variety and final flavour, debate the advantages of different storage materials, share discoveries about timing and temperature control. These conversations have the intensity of artisans who have found something new and exciting to master. But in the evenings, when work gives way to celebration, the wine serves a different purpose. It creates an atmosphere where people feel comfortable sharing stories, music and dance in ways that might feel too exposed or vulnerable under normal circumstances. The same liquid that facilitates technical discussions during the day enables emotional and artistic expression after sunset. You notice that wine seems to reveal aspects of personality that people usually keep hidden. The quiet blacksmith turns out to have a beautiful singing voice that emerges only after he's had a cup or two. A serious merchant's wife shows a talent for improvised comedy that makes everyone laugh until their sides hurt. 2 young people who have been shyly attracted to each other for months finally find the courage to acknowledge their feelings. But you also observe wine's capacity for causing problems. Some people become argumentative or emotional in unpleasant ways. Others lose their judgment about appropriate behaviour, saying things or making advances that create awkward situations. A few individuals seem unable to control their consumption, drinking until they become sick or pass out. These negative experiences lead to the development of customs and rules around wine consumption. Communities begin establishing guidelines about when, where, and how much wine should be consumed. They create rituals that emphasize sharing and moderation rather than individual indulgence. They develop roles for designated leaders who remain relatively sober to guide group activities and intervene if someone's behavior becomes problematic. What fascinates you is how these early wine customs reflect deeper values about community, pleasure, and the relationship between individual desires and collective well-being. Wine becomes a test case for how societies handle activities that can be either beneficial or harmful, depending on how they're managed. The same substance that can enhance creativity, social bonding, and spiritual experience can also lead to violence, poor judgment, and addiction. Semele, now recognized as one of the most skilled winemakers in the region, becomes something like a priestess of this new art. People seek her advice not just about fermentation techniques, but about the proper use of wine in various social and religious contexts. She develops rituals for blessing new vintages, guidelines for sharing wine at weddings and funerals, and practices for incorporating wine into religious ceremonies honoring various gods. Through her, you learn that winemaking is ultimately about transformation, the transformation of grapes into something more complex, of individuals into a more connected community, of ordinary time into sacred celebration. The technical skills required for fermentation become metaphors for other kinds of change that require patience, attention, and willingness to work with forces beyond human control. As the harvest season ends and the year's wine begins its slow process of aging and development, you find yourself thinking about the relationship between waiting and reward, between human effort and natural processes, between the simple desire for something sweet to drink and the complex cultural practices that have grown up around wine production and consumption. The clay jars buried in cool cellars will continue their quiet work through the winter months, transforming grape juice into something richer and more complex. Communities will continue developing customs and traditions that help them make good use of wine's gifts, while avoiding its dangers, and somewhere in this process the foundations are being laid for religious practices that will eventually centre around a god named Dionysus, who embodies both the creative and destructive potential of transformation itself. That tension between wine's creative and destructive potential becomes much more dramatic when you encounter the story of a young king who refused to accept the power of transformation, who tried to control what couldn't be controlled, and who paid a terrible price for his rigid thinking. You find yourself in the ancient city of Thebes during the heat of summer, when the air shimmers above stone streets and everyone seeks shade during the middle hours of the day. The city feels tense, charged with the kind of nervous energy that builds before thunderstorms. King Pentheus, young and newly crowned, paces the halls of his palace like a caged animal, receiving reports that make him increasingly angry and worried. The reports all concern his cousin Dionysus, who has returned to Thebes claiming to be a god and demanding recognition from the city where his mother Semele once lived. But Pentheus remembers the family stories about Semele's death, struck by lightning when she was pregnant, and he believes Dionysus is simply an impostor using divine claims to gain power and influence. The idea that this cousin might actually be immortal, actually divine, seems impossible to accept. What makes Pentheus even more furious are the reports about Dionysus's followers, particularly the women who have left their homes to join his wild celebrations in the mountains outside the city. These women, called Maenads, have abandoned their normal responsibilities as wives, mothers, and daughters to dance and drink wine in religious ecstasy. From Pentheus's perspective, this represents a complete breakdown of social order. You watch Pentheus receiving these reports in his throne room, his advisors carefully describing what they've observed without making direct recommendations about how to respond. The women gather at dawn, they say, bringing wine and musical instruments to remote groves where they spend entire days in celebration. They wear fawn skins instead of proper clothing, crown their hair with ivy and vine leaves, and carry staffs topped with pine cones that they claim possess magical powers. But it's not just the unusual clothing and activities that disturb Pentheus. According to the reports, these women seem to have acquired supernatural abilities during their religious celebrations. They can strike rocks with their staffs and cause springs of fresh water to flow. They can touch the ground and make wine bubble up from the earth. Wild animals approach them without fear, and some witnesses claim to have seen the women nursing wolf cubs and deer fawns as if they were human babies. More troubling still are reports about the women's physical capabilities during their ecstatic rituals. Elderly grandmothers dance with the energy and grace of teenagers. Mothers who normally struggle to carry heavy water jugs can apparently tear fully grown trees apart with their bare hands. They run through thorny underbrush without getting scratched, walk through fire without being burned, and seem to feel no fatigue even during celebrations that last from sunrise to sunset. Pentheus listens to these accounts with growing skepticism and irritation. As a rational ruler trained in practical governance, He assumes these stories are either exaggerated or deliberately fabricated. People always embellish unusual events in the telling, and religious enthusiasm tends to make observers see miracles where none exist. What concerns him more are the social implications of women abandoning their households to participate in unsupervised religious activities. From his palace, you can see the effects of the women's absence throughout the city. Looms stand empty because the weavers have gone to the mountains. Children wander the streets looking for mothers who disappeared before dawn. Meals go unprepared, houses uncleaned, domestic routines disrupted. The fabric of daily life that depends on women's consistent labour is beginning to unravel. Pentheus decides that the situation requires immediate and decisive action. He issues orders for the arrest of Dionysus and his followers, and he organises a military expedition to capture the women in the mountains and forcibly return them to their proper roles. But when his soldiers attempt to arrest Dionysus, they find themselves dealing with phenomena they can't explain or control. The chains they place on Dionysus fall off by themselves. The prison cell where they lock him springs open without anyone touching the door. When they try to capture his followers, the women seem to vanish into the forest like smoke, reappearing moments later in places where it should have been impossible for them to travel so quickly. The soldiers return to Pentheus confused and shaken, reporting events that don't fit their understanding of how the world normally works. Rather than reconsidering his assumptions, Pentheus becomes more determined to prove that Dionysus is a fraud, and his followers are simply engaging in elaborate trickery. He decides that he needs better intelligence about what's actually happening in these mountain celebrations, information that will allow him to expose the deception and restore rational order to his city. This decision leads Pentheus to plan a secret reconnaissance mission. Disguised as a woman, wearing feminine clothing and a wig that conceals his masculine features, he will infiltrate the Maenads' celebration and observe their activities firsthand. Once he understands their methods, he'll be able to develop effective countermeasures and prove to his subjects that these apparent miracles have perfectly ordinary explanations. You follow Pentheus as he prepares for this mission, watching him practice walking in long robes, learning to modulate his voice to sound more feminine, studying the gestures and mannerisms that will help him blend in with the women he plans to spy upon. He approaches this disguise with the same methodical attention he brings to military planning, convinced that careful preparation will ensure success. But what Pentheus doesn't understand is that the Maenads' ecstatic state gives them heightened perceptual abilities. Their religious intoxication doesn't cloud their senses, it sharpens them, allowing them to detect subtle signs and patterns that ordinary consciousness might miss. They can sense emotions, intentions, and even identity in ways that have nothing to do with visual appearance. When Pentheus arrives at the mountain grove where the women are celebrating, his disguise initially seems effective. He positions himself at the edge of the group, observing their activities while trying to remain inconspicuous. What he sees both confirms and contradicts his expectations about what has been happening in these gatherings. The women are indeed drinking wine and dancing in ways that violate normal social conventions. They move with abandon, their bodies expressing emotions and impulses that proper society requires them to suppress. Their songs are improvised rather than formal, full of references to natural forces, sexual desires, and mystical experiences that respectable women aren't supposed to discuss publicly. But Pentheus also observes genuine caring and community among the celebrants. They share food with each other generously, tend to anyone who becomes tired or overwhelmed, and seem to operate by unspoken agreements about mutual support and protection. The older women guide and protect the younger ones, while the younger ones provide energy and enthusiasm that revitalizes their elders. More unsettling for Pentheus are the phenomena he can't explain away as mere enthusiasm or group psychology. He watches women handle fire without apparent pain, sees them communicate with wild animals that should fear human contact, observes them discovering food and water in places where such resources shouldn't exist. These events happen repeatedly, witnessed by multiple people, under conditions that make trickery seem unlikely. As the celebration intensifies and the women enter deeper states of religious ecstasy, their awareness becomes even more acute. They begin looking in Pentheus's direction, with expressions that suggest they know exactly who he is and why he's there. Their songs begin including references to hidden enemies and false sisters that seem clearly directed at him. The moment of discovery comes when the women surround Pentheus, their ecstatic joy transforming into something much more dangerous. In their heightened state, They perceive him not just as a man in disguise, but as a fundamental threat to everything they hold sacred. He represents the forces of control, suppression and denial that they have temporarily escaped through their religious celebrations. What happens next demonstrates the dark side of Dionysiac madness, the destructive potential that balances wine's gifts of creativity and community. The women, led by Pentheus's own mother Agave, attack the disguised king with a fury that seems to draw power from sources beyond ordinary human strength. They tear at him with their hands and teeth, treating him not as a human being, but as a wild animal that threatens their safety. Pentheus's final moments reveal the tragic irony of his situation. In trying to maintain rational control over irrational forces, he has created the conditions for his own destruction. His refusal to acknowledge the legitimate power of transformation has led him into a situation where transformation occurs in its most violent and uncontrollable form. Agave, still in her ecstatic trance, carries what she believes is the head of a wild lion back to Thebes, planning to display this trophy as evidence of her prowess as a hunter. Only when the religious intoxication wears off does she realize that she has killed her own son, that her divine ecstasy has led her to commit the most terrible act a mother can imagine. The story of Pentheus serves as a warning about the dangers of trying to suppress or control the human need for transcendence, transformation, and release from ordinary constraints. But it also illustrates the risks that come with abandoning all rational boundaries, with allowing ecstatic experience to override moral and social considerations entirely. You witness the aftermath of this tragedy, watching how the city of Thebes struggles to make sense of what has happened and how to prevent similar disasters in the future. Some people conclude that Dionysus should be rejected entirely, that any religion capable of producing such violence must be fundamentally evil. Others argue that the tragedy occurred because Pentheus approached the divine power in the wrong way, with hostility and deception rather than respect and openness. The wisest observers, however, recognize that the story reveals something important about the nature of transformation itself. Change, whether personal, social, or spiritual, always involves the destruction of old patterns to make room for new ones. This process can be creative and beneficial when it occurs gradually, with proper guidance and support. But when change is suppressed or forced to happen suddenly, it tends to manifest in chaotic and destructive ways. As you reflect on Pentheus's fate, you might consider how this ancient story relates to modern situations where people or institutions try to control forces that resist control, where rational planning encounters the unpredictable aspects of human nature, where the desire for order conflicts with equally valid needs for freedom and spontaneity. The tragedy of Pentheus leads us naturally to consider how the Greeks eventually found safer ways to encounter the transformative power of Dionysus, through theatre, where the dangerous madness of direct divine experience could be channeled into structured storytelling that both thrilled and educated audiences. You find yourself in Athens during the early morning hours before a festival of Dionysus, when the city is still quiet but filled with anticipation. The great theatre built into the hillside below the Acropolis sits empty for now, its stone seats waiting for the thousands of citizens who will spend the next 3 days watching plays that blend entertainment, religious ritual, and civic education into something entirely new in human history. The theatre itself is a marvel of engineering and acoustics, carved into the natural slope of the hill so that even the highest seats provide clear views of the performance area below. The circular orchestra, where actors and chorus will dance and sing, is backed by a simple wooden building that serves as both dressing room and scenic backdrop. Everything about the design emphasizes the communal nature of the experience. This is not entertainment for small elite audiences, but a civic ceremony that brings together the entire population of Athens. You arrive early to watch the preparations, observing how the physical space transforms as workers prepare for the day's performances. Priests of Dionysus conduct purification rituals, sprinkling wine and water on the performance area, burning incense that fills the morning air with sweet smoke. A statue of Dionysus is carried in procession from his temple and placed in a position of honor where the god can symbolically watch the plays being performed in his name. The actors arrive while the sun is still low on the horizon. 3 men who will spend the day portraying multiple characters by changing masks and costumes. You watch them prepare in the wooden building behind the performance area, transforming themselves from ordinary citizens into kings, gods, heroes, and monsters through the ancient art of theatrical impersonation. But it's the masks that truly fascinate you. Each one is a work of art, carved from wood and painted with expressions that seem to shift depending on the angle of view and the quality of light. The tragic masks convey profound emotions: grief, rage, despair, noble suffering, while the comic masks display exaggerated features that provoke laughter even before any words are spoken. When an actor puts on a mask, his individual personality disappears, replaced by the archetypal character the mask represents. This transformation echoes the transformations associated with Dionysus himself. Just as wine can temporarily change a person's personality, revealing hidden aspects of their nature, the theatrical mask allows an actor to become someone entirely different, to speak thoughts and feel emotions that belong to the character rather than the performer. It's a controlled form of possession, a way of experiencing divine madness within safe artistic boundaries. The chorus members arrive as the theatre begins filling with spectators. These are not professional performers, but ordinary citizens who have spent months rehearsing the songs and dances that will comment on and interpret the action of the play. They represent the community's voice, the collective wisdom, and emotional response of the audience projected onto the performance itself. As you watch them practice their movements one final time, you notice how the chorus serves as a bridge between the actors and the audience, between the mythical world of the story and the real world of Athenian civic life. Their songs often address the audience directly, asking questions about justice, fate, and moral responsibility that the spectators must answer for themselves. The audience begins arriving well before dawn, bringing cushions to soften the stone seats, food and wine to sustain them through the long day of performances, and the kind of excited anticipation usually reserved for religious festivals or athletic competitions. These theatre festivals are among the most important events in the Athenian calendar, combining entertainment, education, religious observance, and civic pride into a unique cultural experience. You find a seat among the ordinary citizens, craftsmen, farmers, merchants, freed slaves, and notice how the theatre audience represents the entire spectrum of Athenian society. Wealthy citizens occupy the best seats near the performance area, but even the poorest residents can afford tickets to these performances, which are subsidised by the city government as part of their civic and religious obligations. The first play of the day is a tragedy, telling the story of Oedipus, the king who unknowingly killed his father and married his mother. As the performance begins, you experience something that feels almost like the controlled madness of Dionysiac celebration. The combination of music, poetry, dance, and visual spectacle creates an altered state of consciousness that allows you to enter imaginatively into experiences far removed from your ordinary life. Through the medium of theatre, you experience what it might feel like to be a king discovering that everything you believed about your identity was wrong. You feel the horror of realizing that your best intentions have led to terrible consequences, the anguish of recognizing that knowledge can be more painful than ignorance. These are emotions and insights that you might never encounter in your regular daily existence, but which the theatre makes temporarily accessible through the power of dramatic identification. The audience around you responds to the play with an intensity that surprises visitors from other cities. People gasp audibly at moments of revelation, weep openly during scenes of suffering, argue quietly with each other during choral interludes about the moral implications of what they're witnessing. The theatre has created a space where emotional expression that might seem excessive in ordinary social situations becomes not just acceptable, but appropriate. Between tragedies, a satyr play provides comic relief, featuring actors dressed as half-human, half-goat followers of Dionysus who bumble their way through a simplified version of mythological adventures. These performances are deliberately crude and silly, full of physical comedy and sexual humour that allows the audience to release tension built up during the serious dramas. You notice how the satyr plays serve a function similar to wine in Dionysiac celebrations. They provide a safe outlet for impulses and desires that civilized society normally requires people to suppress. The half-animal satyrs represent the bestial side of human nature, but in a context that makes their behaviour amusing rather than threatening. Through laughter, the audience can acknowledge their own capacity for foolishness, lust, and selfishness, without feeling ashamed or guilty. The day's final performance is a comedy by Aristophanes, a play that ruthlessly satirizes contemporary Athenian politics and social customs. You watch prominent citizens being mocked by name, their personal quirks and political positions exaggerated for comedic effect. In any other context, such public ridicule might lead to lawsuits or violence. But the theatre provides a protected space where even the most powerful people can be criticised and ridiculed without fear of retaliation. This aspect of theatrical performance represents another form of Dionysiac transformation, the temporary suspension of normal social hierarchies and conventions. For the duration of the comedy, slaves can laugh at masters, the poor can mock the rich, and ordinary citizens can see their leaders portrayed as buffoons and hypocrites. It's a controlled form of social revolution, a way of releasing tensions that might otherwise explode into actual conflict. As the sun sets and the day's performances end, you find yourself emotionally exhausted but intellectually stimulated. Through the medium of theatre, you have experienced a full range of human emotions, confronted complex moral questions, laughed at human folly, and participated in a form of community ritual that strengthens social bonds while acknowledging social tensions. Walking home through the darkening streets of Athens, you reflect on how the theatre has transformed the dangerous madness associated with Dionysus into something socially beneficial. Instead of abandoning rational thought entirely, theatrical performance uses carefully structured stories to create controlled experiences of transformation and transcendence. The masks worn by actors allow for psychological transformation without losing individual identity. The mythological stories provide safe context for exploring dangerous emotions and situations. The communal nature of the audience ensures that these intense experiences are shared rather than isolating. The religious framework reminds everyone that they are participating in something sacred, not merely entertaining. Over the following days, you notice how the theatre festival has affected the mood and conversations throughout Athens. People quote lines from the plays, debate the moral choices made by dramatic characters, use theatrical metaphors to discuss contemporary political issues. The stories performed in Dionysus's theatre have become part of the city's collective imagination, providing common references and shared insights that strengthen civic culture. But you also recognise that theatre, like wine, carries both benefits and risks. The same emotional intensity that makes dramatic performance so powerful can also be manipulated for political purposes. The same suspension of critical judgment that allows audiences to enter imaginatively into fictional worlds can make them vulnerable to demagogues and propagandists. The same communal experience that strengthens social bonds can also be used to promote conformity and suppress dissent. The genius of connecting theatre to Dionysus lies in acknowledging these contradictions rather than trying to resolve them. The wine god represents both creativity and destruction, both social bonding and individual madness, both spiritual transcendence and physical indulgence. By placing theatrical performance under his patronage, the Greeks recognized that art, like intoxication, is a powerful force that must be approached with both reverence and caution. As you drift off to sleep after this long day of dramatic performances, you might find yourself wondering about the relationship between stories and dreams, between the transformations that occur in theatre and those that happen in sleep, between the collective visions shared by audiences and the private visions that visit individuals in the darkness of night. Those questions about collective and private visions lead us deeper into the agricultural rhythms that shaped ancient Greek life, where the grape harvest became more than just practical work. It transformed into elaborate festivals that revealed hidden truths about time, mortality, and the cycles that govern both human life and natural processes. You find yourself in a hillside vineyard during the harvest season, when the air is crisp with approaching autumn, and the grapevines hang heavy with fruit that has been slowly ripening through the long hot summer. The work begins before dawn, when the grapes are cool and firm, less likely to be damaged by handling. Your hands move automatically through familiar motions, testing fruit for ripeness, cutting clusters carefully to avoid bruising, carrying baskets that grow heavier as the morning progresses. But this year's harvest feels different from previous ones. Word has spread through the farming communities about new religious practices associated with Dionysus, rituals that transform the practical work of grape picking into something approaching sacred ceremony. The elderly vineyard owner, a woman named Anthea who has been making wine for 40 years, has decided to experiment with these new approaches to harvest celebration. Instead of simply gathering grapes as quickly as possible and pressing them immediately for wine, Anthea has organised the harvest according to lunar phases and seasonal timing that supposedly enhance the spiritual significance of the work. The actual picking begins at the moment when dawnlight first touches the highest vines, and it proceeds according to patterns that honour different aspects of Dionysus's nature and different stages of the grape's transformation from living fruit to fermented wine. You work alongside families who have been tending these vines for generations, but their familiar tasks now carry additional layers of meaning. Each cluster of grapes represents not just potential wine, but a symbol of life's abundance and the temporary nature of all earthly pleasures. The juice that stains your hands purple becomes a reminder of blood, sacrifice, and the price that must be paid for transformation. As the sun climbs higher and the work continues, Anthea begins teaching songs that are supposed to accompany grape picking, melodies that match the rhythm of cutting and gathering while telling stories about Dionysus's journey through death and rebirth. These aren't the casual work songs that usually help pass time during repetitive labour. They're carefully structured pieces that seem designed to induce a particular state of consciousness in the singers. The songs work in layers, starting with simple, repetitive verses about the practical aspects of harvest work, then gradually introducing more complex themes about seasonal change, human mortality, and the mysteries of fermentation. By the time the sun reaches its peak, you find yourself entering a trance-like state, where the physical work of picking grapes becomes almost automatic, while your mind focuses on the deeper meanings embedded in the music and the ritualized movements. During the midday break, when the heat becomes too intense for comfortable outdoor work, Anthea gathers the harvest workers in the shade of ancient oak trees that overlook the vineyard. Instead of simply resting and eating, this becomes a time for storytelling and reflection about the significance of what they're doing. She explains how the grape harvest represents a crucial moment in the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that governs all life. The grapes, she says, must die as living fruit in order to be transformed into wine. This death is not a loss but a necessary transition that allows the essential spirit of the grape to take on new forms with greater power and complexity. Similarly, human beings must be willing to let go of old versions of themselves in order to grow and develop. The Harvest Festival celebrates this principle of transformation through destruction, of renewal through apparent ending. You listen to these teachings while eating bread and cheese, drinking water from clay cups that stay cool even in the heat, watching the play of light and shadow across the vineyard below. The familiar landscape seems different when viewed through this lens of symbolic meaning. The rows of vines become metaphors for human lifespans. The clusters of grapes represent individual souls, and the entire agricultural process mirrors the spiritual journey from birth through death to some form of continuation or rebirth. When work resumes in the cooler afternoon hours, the grape picking takes on the quality of a moving meditation. Workers spread out across the vineyard in patterns that echo the formations used in religious dances, maintaining visual and auditory contact through songs and calls that coordinate both practical tasks and spiritual focus. The harvest becomes a form of communal prayer, a way of participating actively in the natural cycles that sustain all life. As evening approaches and the day's picked grapes are transported to the pressing area, the festival moves into its next phase. The actual crushing of the grapes becomes a ceremony that requires careful preparation and ritualized actions. The pressing equipment, large wooden vats and stone weights, is blessed with wine from previous years and decorated with garlands of vine leaves, flowers, and herbs that are sacred to Dionysus. The first pressing is performed by volunteers who remove their shoes and enter the grape-filled vats to crush the fruit with their feet. This ancient method, slower and less efficient than using mechanical presses, is chosen specifically for its symbolic significance. The human body becomes directly involved in the transformation process, creating intimate physical contact between people and the grapes that will become wine. You take your turn in the pressing vats, feeling the grapes burst under your feet, the juice flowing between your toes, the pulp and skins creating a slippery, sensuous surface that requires balance and attention. The experience is simultaneously practical and deeply sensual, connecting you to the raw materials of wine production in ways that normal drinking never provides. Your feet become purple up to the ankles, marking you as a participant in this ancient transformation process. The juice that flows from this first pressing is considered especially sacred, possessing spiritual qualities that later mechanical pressing cannot duplicate. Some of it is set aside for use in religious ceremonies, some is shared immediately among the harvest workers as a communion drink, and some is reserved for the festival's climactic celebration that will continue long into the night. As darkness falls and torches are lit around the pressing area, the harvest festival transitions from work to celebration, from practical grape processing to ecstatic ritual. Musicians appear with instruments, lyres, flutes, and drums. that provide rhythms for dancing that becomes increasingly uninhibited as the evening progresses and more of the fresh grape juice is consumed. But this isn't simply a party where people drink and dance until they collapse. The celebration follows patterns that are designed to recreate Dionysus's own journey through death and rebirth, allowing participants to experience symbolically the same transformation that grapes undergo when they become wine. The dances, songs, and ritual actions tell this story through movement and music rather than words. You find yourself drawn into dances that begin with slow, mournful movements representing the death of the grapes, progress through chaotic, frenzied actions that symbolize the fermentation process, and culminate in joyful, ecstatic celebrations of the new wine that will emerge from apparent destruction. Your body becomes a text that tells the story of transformation, your movements a form of prayer that doesn't require language or rational thought. The fresh grape juice, consumed in quantities that would be impossible with finished wine, produces effects that are different from ordinary alcohol intoxication. The natural sugars and unfermented compounds create a form of altered consciousness that feels more gentle and dreamy than the sharp intoxication of wine. Colours seem more vivid, sounds more meaningful, physical sensations more intense. Time stretches and contracts unpredictably, making the festival feel like it lasts for days rather than hours. Under the influence of this natural intoxication, the boundaries between individual participants begin to dissolve. The harvest workers, who began the day as separate people with distinct personalities and social roles, increasingly function as a single organism responding to shared rhythms and collective inspiration. Personal inhibitions and social conventions become less important than the group's movement through the ritualized celebration of transformation. As the night reaches its deepest point, somewhere around midnight when the autumn stars shine brightest, the festival enters its most sacred phase. Participants who have been dancing and singing for hours enter states of consciousness that approach genuine religious ecstasy. Some claim to see visions of Dionysus himself, others report communication with deceased relatives, still others experience profound insights about the nature of existence and their place in the cosmic order. These mystical experiences aren't dismissed as mere hallucinations or the products of too much grape juice. Instead, they're understood as genuine encounters with divine reality, moments when the veil between ordinary consciousness and spiritual truth becomes temporarily transparent. The Harvest Festival creates conditions where such experiences can occur safely, supported by community ritual rather than isolated individual practice. You find your own consciousness altered in ways that are difficult to describe or remember clearly afterward. The vineyard around you seems alive with presence and meaning that normal perception misses. The sounds of celebration, music, laughter, voices raised in song, become a language that speaks directly to your soul without requiring translation by your rational mind. The stars overhead appear to pulse in rhythm with your heartbeat, and you understand viscerally that you are part of something much larger and more complex than your individual existence. When dawn finally arrives, bringing the festival to its natural conclusion, participants gradually return to ordinary consciousness, but they carry with them memories and insights that will influence their understanding of life, death, and spiritual possibility for years to come. The grape harvest has accomplished more than just producing wine. It has provided a communal experience of transcendence that strengthens both individual faith and community bonds. As you help clean up the pressing area and prepare for the long process of fermenting the juice that will become this year's wine, you reflect on how the Harvest Festival has revealed hidden connections between agricultural work, religious experience, and community building. The practical necessity of gathering and processing grapes has been transformed into an opportunity for spiritual growth and social bonding that enriches every aspect of participants' lives. That experience of communal transcendence and spiritual growth brings us to one of the most mysterious and powerful aspects of Dionysiac worship: the women who left their ordinary lives behind to follow the god into mountain wildernesses, where they discovered forms of freedom and religious ecstasy that challenged every assumption about proper feminine behavior. You find yourself following a group of these women, called Maenads, as they make their way through forested hills at dawn, moving with purpose towards sacred groves where they will spend the day in celebration that most people would consider dangerously excessive. These aren't wild, uncivilized women, as hostile observers often claim. They're mothers, wives, daughters, and sisters who have temporarily abandoned their domestic responsibilities to answer what they believe is a divine calling. Walking behind them on the narrow mountain path, You observe how their ordinary appearance contrasts with the extraordinary nature of their mission. They wear simple tunics suitable for outdoor activity, carry woven baskets containing food and wine, and move with the confident stride of women accustomed to physical activity. But their eyes shine with an intensity that suggests inner experiences far removed from the mundane concerns of household management and childcare. The eldest of the group, a woman named Ino, who left her husband's house 3 days ago after experiencing what she describes as a vision of Dionysus, sets the pace and occasionally calls soft instructions to keep the group together. Her transformation from respected matron to religious wanderer illustrates the radical nature of the Maenad experience. In ordinary life, she manages a complex household, supervises servants, and serves as an advisor to younger women in her community. But here in the mountains, she functions as a priestess and guide for mystical experiences that transcend social roles and conventional identities. You listen to conversations that reveal how these women understand their temporary abandonment of domestic life. They don't see themselves as neglecting their responsibilities or betraying their families. Instead, they believe they're responding to a divine command that takes precedence over human obligations. Dionysus has called them to experience forms of spiritual joy and freedom that are impossible within the constraints of ordinary social existence. The youngest member of the group, barely past childhood, explains how she received her call during a dream where Dionysus appeared as a beautiful young man surrounded by grapevines and wild animals. He didn't speak to her in words, she says, but somehow communicated that she needed to join other women who were already following his path. When she woke, she found grape leaves and flowers beside her bed, though it was the wrong season for such plants to bloom naturally. These stories of divine calling aren't dismissed by the other women as fantasies or delusions. They share similar experiences, dreams, visions, unexplained phenomena that convince them to leave their homes and seek religious experiences in the wilderness. A middle-aged weaver describes how her loom began producing patterns she hadn't planned, creating images of ivy, wine cups, and dancing figures. A young mother tells how her infant son stopped crying whenever she sang hymns to Dionysus, but became fussy when she tried to resume normal lullabies. When the group reaches their sacred grove, the transformation from ordinary women to ecstatic worshippers begins gradually. They unpack their supplies methodically, sharing bread and cheese while discussing practical matters like how long they plan to stay and whether the weather will hold. But as they begin passing around wine and singing hymns to Dionysus, their voices grow stronger and their movements more fluid. The careful, social boundaries that normally govern interactions between women of different ages and social classes begin to dissolve. You watch from a respectful distance as their celebration intensifies throughout the morning. What begins as structured religious observance gradually becomes something wilder and more spontaneous. They dance in patterns that seem choreographed but are actually improvised, each woman responding to the music and movement of the others in ways that create surprising harmonies and rhythms. Their voices blend in songs that mix traditional hymns with improvised verses expressing their personal experiences of divine connection. The most remarkable aspect of their celebration is how it allows them to express aspects of themselves that have no place in ordinary domestic life. Ino, the respected matron, begins telling jokes that would shock her usual social circle, stories about the absurdities of managing a household and the secret frustrations of being constantly responsible for other people's welfare. Her humour is not cruel or bitter, but it reveals perspectives on domestic life that women rarely acknowledge publicly. A young wife whose marriage was arranged by her parents speaks openly about her longing for romance and passion, desires that seem almost revolutionary in the context of ancient Greek society, where women's emotional lives were expected to centre around duty and family welfare. But here in the sacred grove, surrounded by women who have temporarily stepped outside conventional roles, such confessions feel natural and necessary rather than scandalous. As the day progresses and more wine is consumed, the boundary between worship and wildness becomes increasingly blurred. The women begin behaviours that would be considered inappropriate or even dangerous in normal circumstances. They climb trees to gather branches for decoration, paying no attention to the risk of falling. They run through the forest, calling out to Dionysus, their voices echoing off distant mountains. Some claim to see the god himself moving through the shadows between trees, beckoning them toward even greater abandon. But you also observe how their apparent madness follows certain patterns and maintains internal logic. Despite their ecstatic behaviour, they take care of each other, making sure nobody wanders off alone or consumes so much wine that they become truly incapacitated. When one young woman becomes overwhelmed by the intensity of her religious experience and begins sobbing uncontrollably, the others surround her with comfort and protection until she recovers her composure. The climax of their celebration comes at sunset, when they perform a dance that seems to channel the god's presence directly. Moving in a circle around a grapevine they've decorated with flowers and ribbons, they create music using only their voices and the rhythm of their feet against the earth. The song they sing has no words, just sounds that seem to express pure emotion, joy, longing, gratitude, and a kind of fierce freedom that most people never experience. As darkness falls and the celebration winds down, you witness their gradual return to ordinary consciousness. The transformation happens slowly, like someone waking from a vivid dream. They sit in small groups sharing food and quietly processing their experiences. Some describe visions they received during the height of their ecstasy. Others talk about emotional releases that have freed them from burdens they've carried for months or years. When morning comes, they begin the journey back to their ordinary lives, but something essential has changed. They move with a different kind of confidence, speak with voices that carry new authority. The young mother mentions plans to negotiate better working conditions with her husband. The weaver talks about expanding her business to include designs inspired by her religious visions. Eno, the group leader, describes feeling renewed energy for the responsibilities she temporarily abandoned. As you watch them descend the mountain paths toward their respective homes, you reflect on the complex relationship between individual fulfillment and social obligation, between the need for transcendent experience and the demands of daily life. The Maenads have found a way to honour both, using their periodic escapes into divine madness as a source of strength and renewal that actually enhances their ability to fulfill their conventional roles. The story of women finding strength through temporary abandonment of social roles brings us to a darker tale about those who failed to recognise divine power when they encountered it. You find yourself aboard a merchant vessel sailing through the wine-dark Aegean Sea, where the horizon stretches endlessly in all directions, and the only sounds are waves against the hull and wind in the rigging. The crew of this ship represents a different kind of Greek, not farmers or city dwellers, but men who make their living from the sea and the opportunities it provides. These are practical people who deal in concrete realities, weather patterns, trade routes, cargo values, and the constant calculation of risk versus profit that governs maritime commerce. They have little patience for religious speculation or mystical experiences that can't be translated into tangible benefits. The trouble begins when they rescue a young man from a small boat that appears to be drifting aimlessly in open water. He's well dressed and carries himself with the confidence of nobility, but he has no visible wealth or trade goods. His story about being separated from his travelling companions during a storm seems plausible enough, and maritime tradition requires helping fellow travellers in distress. But the crew's initial act of charity quickly transforms into something more predatory. The rescued passenger introduces himself as Dionysus, a name that means nothing to these seafaring men. They've heard vague stories about new gods and foreign cults, but such matters seem irrelevant to the practical business of sailing and trading. What interests them is the quality of his clothes, the refined way he speaks, and his obvious unfamiliarity with shipboard life. He seems like the kind of wealthy young man whose family would pay handsomely for his safe return. You watch their plans develop through subtle conversations and meaningful glances exchanged when they think the passenger isn't paying attention. Instead of sailing toward the nearest port to land him safely, they begin discussing destinations where they might find buyers for an educated slave. The young man's obvious intelligence and good breeding would make him valuable in markets that cater to wealthy households seeking tutors or administrative assistants. But you also notice things about the passenger that the crew misses or dismisses. His complete lack of fear, despite being stranded at sea, suggests either remarkable courage or knowledge of something they don't understand. When he examines their cargo of wine jars, he comments knowledgeably about vintage fermentation techniques and proper storage methods. His questions about their usual trade routes reveal familiarity with ports and markets throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The first sign of trouble comes when they attempt to bind him with ropes. The task seems simple enough. He's outnumbered 10-1, and shipboard rope work is second nature to experienced sailors. But every knot they tie somehow loosens before they can secure the next one. Ropes that should hold firm slip through their fingers like water. Bindings that look tight from a distance prove ineffective when tested. The crew attributes these failures to nervousness or bad luck, but you begin to suspect something more supernatural is occurring. Their captive remains remarkably calm throughout these attempted restraints, neither resisting actively nor cooperating. He watches their struggles with what might be amusement or pity, occasionally offering helpful suggestions about knot-tying techniques that the sailors ignore in their growing frustration. His composure in the face of imminent enslavement strikes you as either superhuman confidence or divine authority. The transformation begins subtly, with changes so gradual that most of the crew doesn't notice them immediately. The wine in their cargo hold, which has been stable and properly stored for weeks, begins fermenting again, filling the lower decks with sweet, intoxicating aromas. Grapevines sprout from the ship's wooden rails, growing with impossible speed until they cover much of the rigging with green leaves and purple fruit. As these miraculous changes accelerate, the prisoner's true nature becomes undeniable. His appearance shifts from that of a well-dressed young man to something more obviously divine, taller, more radiant, with eyes that seem to hold depths no mortal gaze could contain. When he speaks, his voice carries authority that makes even the most hardened sailors step back in involuntary respect. The crew's response to these revelations reveals different aspects of human nature under stress. Some recognize their error immediately and begin pleading for forgiveness, throwing themselves at Dionysus's feet and begging for mercy. Others remain defiant, claiming the manifestations are tricks or illusions designed to frighten them into releasing a valuable captive. A few seem paralyzed by fear, unable to process what they're witnessing. But the god's punishment, when it comes, is neither immediate nor uniformly harsh. Instead of striking them down with divine lightning or calling up storms to sink their ship, he transforms them in ways that reflect their essential natures. Those who showed mercy and recognition of their error are spared and allowed to continue their lives with newfound wisdom about respecting divine power. The others undergo more dramatic changes. Sailors who showed particular cruelty in planning to sell him into slavery find themselves becoming the sea creatures they've spent their lives hunting and capturing. Their transformation into dolphins is not presented as entirely punitive. Dolphins are intelligent, social creatures who live freely in the ocean. But they've lost their human capacity for choice and moral reasoning, becoming creatures of instinct rather than conscious decision-making. You witness the final transformation from the safety of a small boat that the god provides for those who showed respect for divine power. The ship that attempted to transport a captive god becomes overgrown with so much marine vegetation that it resembles a floating garden more than a vessel. Seaweed replaces the rigging, coral encrusts the hull, and schools of fish make their homes in what used to be the cargo hold. As you sail away from this scene of divine justice, you reflect on the relationship between power and recognition, between the impulse to exploit others and the risks that such exploitation carries. The pirate's fate illustrates not just the consequences of disrespecting gods, but the deeper spiritual blindness that prevents people from recognizing sacred presence in unexpected forms. The dramatic tale of divine justice at sea brings us to a gentler but equally mysterious story about an entire city that experienced something miraculous and strange, something that left everyone with slightly different memories of what actually happened. You find yourself in Naxos, the largest of the Cyclades Islands, during the wine festival season when the streets should be filled with celebration, but instead seem oddly quiet. Naxos has a reputation throughout the Greek world for producing excellent wine and hosting memorable festivals. The island's volcanic soil and perfect climate create conditions that make grapes grow with unusual vigour, and the residents have developed winemaking techniques that produce vintages sought after by connoisseurs from Athens to Alexandria. During festival season, the island normally attracts visitors from neighbouring islands and the mainland, all eager to participate in celebrations that combine religious devotion with spectacular entertainment. But this year feels different. As you walk through the main town in the early morning, you notice an unusual quietness that has nothing to do with the early hour. People move through their daily routines, opening shops, tending animals, preparing food, but they seem distracted, as if their attention is focused on something happening just beyond the edge of perception. Conversations trail off in the middle of sentences. Workers pause in their tasks to stare at empty spaces where nothing visible is occurring. When you ask about the festival preparations, responses are vague and contradictory. Some people insist the main celebration already happened, though they can't specify exactly when or what it involved. Others claim it's been postponed indefinitely due to circumstances nobody can clearly explain. A few admit they're not sure whether the festival is supposed to occur this week, next week, or perhaps already concluded last week without their participation. The local priest of Dionysus, who should be the ultimate authority on festival scheduling, seems as confused as everyone else. When you visit his shrine seeking clarification, you find him sitting in the courtyard staring at an empty wine cup, turning it slowly in his hands as if it contains answers to questions he can't formulate. "I keep expecting something to happen," he tells you, "but I can't remember what I'm waiting for." As you spend more time in the town, you begin collecting fragments of stories that don't quite fit together. A baker mentions serving bread to an unusually large crowd sometime recently, but she can't remember who they were or why they were gathered. A musician describes playing music that was somehow different from anything he'd performed before, melodies that seemed to create themselves while he played. A group of children insist they participated in dances they'd never learned, following steps that felt familiar despite being completely new. The mystery deepens when you discover physical evidence of celebration that nobody remembers organising. The main square shows signs of recent festival activity. Flower petals scattered on stone pavement, wine stains on walls, garlands still hanging from buildings. But the decorations seem to have appeared overnight without human intervention, and their arrangement follows no traditional pattern that local festival organisers recognise. More puzzling still are the personal items scattered throughout the town, jewellery, scarves, sandals, hair ornaments, that residents claim belong to them but can't remember removing. A respected matron finds her best necklace draped over a fountain she swears she never visited. A young man discovers his festival cloak folded neatly beside a shrine he doesn't recall approaching. These objects aren't lost or stolen. They're carefully placed in locations that seem meaningful but incomprehensible. As evening approaches, the sense of anticipation in the town grows stronger, though nobody can explain what they're anticipating. People gather in small groups without planning to do so, drawn together by impulses they don't understand. Conversations become more animated, though the topics discussed seem less important than the simple act of talking together. Wine appears in people's hands without anyone remembering where it came from, or who provided it. You find yourself swept along in this strange gathering, part of a crowd that forms organically in the main square as darkness falls. No announcement has been made, no formal invitation issued, yet everyone seems to know they belong here at this moment. The assembly includes people from all levels of society, wealthy merchants, working craftsmen, elderly grandparents, young children, united by shared participation in something they can't name. What follows is the most unusual celebration you've ever witnessed. Music begins without musicians appearing on any stage or platform. Voices blend in harmonies that seem to arise spontaneously from the crowd itself. Dancing starts when someone begins moving to rhythms that everyone can hear but nobody is playing. The entire event feels both carefully orchestrated and completely improvised, as if following a script that exists only in the collective unconscious of the participants. The wine that circulates through the crowd tastes unlike anything produced on the island, despite coming from familiar-looking containers. Each person who tastes it experiences something slightly different. Some describe flavours of honey and flowers, others detect hints of exotic spices or fruits that don't grow in this climate. The effect is universally pleasant and mildly intoxicating, but in ways that enhance rather than impair perception and social connection. As the night progresses, the celebration takes on a dreamlike quality that makes precise description impossible. Events seem to occur simultaneously and sequentially. Time moves both quickly and slowly, and participants find themselves in conversations with people they're sure they've never met, who nonetheless feel like old friends. Children play games that adults remember from their own childhood, but haven't thought about in decades. Elderly people share stories that contain details no living person should remember. The most remarkable aspect of the entire evening is how natural everything feels despite its obvious impossibility. Nobody questions the source of the music or the wine, the identity of certain participants who seem familiar but unplaceable, or the way time seems to flow differently than usual. The celebration unfolds with the internal logic of dreams, where extraordinary occurrences feel perfectly reasonable within their own context. When dawn begins to lighten the sky, the gathering disperses as organically as it formed. People drift away in small groups, returning to their homes with satisfied expressions and slightly confused memories of how they spent the night. The square empties gradually, leaving behind only the normal debris of any large gathering. Flower petals, empty cups, a few forgotten personal items that will puzzle their owners when discovered later. In the days that follow, attempts to reconstruct exactly what happened during that mysterious night prove frustratingly unsuccessful. Everyone remembers participating in something wonderful, but the details slip away when examined closely. It's as if the celebration exists perfectly in memory, but dissolves under the scrutiny of rational analysis. Some residents begin to wonder if they shared a collective dream. Others insist the experience was more real than ordinary waking life. As you prepare to leave Naxos, still puzzled by what you witnessed, you carry with you questions about the relationship between memory and experience, between individual and collective consciousness, between the extraordinary events we participate in, and our ability to retain and understand them afterward. Perhaps some celebrations are meant to be experienced rather than remembered, felt rather than analysed, lived rather than preserved for future examination. Our final story brings us full circle, back to the question of identity and transformation that has woven through all these tales of Dionysus and his influence on ancient Greek life. You find yourself in Athens during the early days of theatrical performance, when the idea of actors pretending to be other people was still new and slightly scandalous, when the boundary between religious ritual and artistic entertainment was being explored and defined. The setting is the theatre of Dionysus, carved into the hillside below the Acropolis, where stone seats rise in perfect semicircles to accommodate thousands of spectators. But today you're not in the audience, you're backstage, in the cramped wooden building where actors prepare for performance, watching them transform themselves into gods, heroes and monsters through the ancient art of mask making and costume design. The lead actor, a man named Thespis, who has become famous for his innovative approach to dramatic performance, sits before a polished bronze mirror applying white lead paint to his face with careful, practiced strokes. This makeup serves both practical and symbolic purposes. It makes his features visible to spectators in the distant seats, but it also marks him as someone who has temporarily stepped outside normal human identity to become a vessel for divine or heroic personas. You watch him work with materials that transform not just his appearance, but his entire sense of self. The mask he will wear for today's performance represents Dionysus himself, carved from olive wood by craftsmen who specialize in creating faces that express divine attributes. The features are beautiful but unsettling, eyes that seem to see more than mortal vision allows, a mouth curved in a smile that suggests both benevolence and dangerous knowledge. The process of putting on the mask involves ritual elements that blur the line between artistic preparation and religious ceremony. Thespis first purifies himself with wine, pouring libations to Dionysus, while asking the god's permission to represent his divine nature before a mortal audience. Then he places the mask over his own face, allowing the transformation to occur gradually as he adjusts to seeing the world through different eyes. What happens next is difficult to describe precisely, because it involves changes that go beyond the merely physical. As the mask settles into place, and Thespis begins moving and speaking as Dionysus, something in his posture and voice suggests that the transformation is more complete than simple theatrical impersonation. His gestures carry an authority that seems borrowed from genuinely divine sources. His words, though scripted by human poets, ring with the kind of truth that normally comes only from direct religious experience. The other actors in the company watch this transformation with a mixture of professional admiration and genuine awe. They understand the technical skills involved in effective dramatic performance, voice projection, gesture, timing, emotional expression. But they also recognize that something beyond technique is occurring when Thespis becomes Dionysus. The mask doesn't just disguise his human features, it seems to channel aspects of divine nature that no amount of acting training could simulate. This ambiguous relationship between performance and possession becomes even more complex when you consider the audience that will witness today's drama. They come to the theatre expecting entertainment, but they also come seeking religious experience. The festival of Dionysus that frames these performances is simultaneously artistic competition and sacred ritual, cultural celebration, and spiritual observance. Spectators want to be impressed by skillful acting, but they also hope to encounter the divine presence that the god represents. As performance time approaches, you follow the actors to the edge of the stage area, where they wait for their entrance cues while making final adjustments to costumes and masks. The energy backstage is intense but focused, like the atmosphere in a temple before an important ceremony. These performers understand that they're not just entertaining an audience, they're serving as intermediaries between human and divine realms, using their bodies and voices to make invisible spiritual truths visible and comprehensible. When the performance begins and Thespis steps onto the stage as Dionysus, the audience response confirms that something extraordinary is occurring. Their attention is immediate and complete, but it has a quality different from ordinary theatrical appreciation. They watch with the intensity of people witnessing a religious revelation, not just artistic skill. When the masked actor speaks as the god, delivering lines about the nature of ecstasy and transformation, the words seem to carry divine authority that transcends human authorship. The story being performed deals with themes that echo through all the tales we've explored: the tension between order and chaos, the necessity of accepting forces beyond human control, the transformative power of wine and celebration, the danger of refusing to acknowledge divine presence in unexpected forms. But hearing these themes expressed through the voice of someone who has temporarily become the god himself gives them weight and immediacy that pure storytelling could never achieve. Throughout the performance, you observe how the theatrical format allows both actors and audience to explore dangerous spiritual territory safely. The ecstatic experiences associated with direct Dionysiac worship can be overwhelming and potentially destructive, as the story of Pentheus demonstrated. But in the controlled environment of theatrical performance, these same experiences can be encountered and processed without the risks associated with actual divine possession or religious mania. The masks that enable this safe exploration of transformation serve multiple functions simultaneously. They protect the actors from the full force of divine energies they're channeling, allowing them to step back into ordinary human identity when the performance ends. They signal to the audience that what they're witnessing is both genuine spiritual experience and artistic representation. And they create a space where truths too powerful for normal discourse can be expressed and received. When the performance concludes and the actors remove their masks, the transition back to ordinary human identity is gradual and carefully managed. Thespis sits quietly for several minutes, allowing the divine presence he's been channeling to withdraw completely before attempting normal conversation. His fellow performers help him clean off the makeup and change into everyday clothes, treating the process as a reverse ritual that requires the same care and attention as the original transformation. As the audience disperses and the theatre empties, you reflect on what you've witnessed. The birth of an art form that would influence human culture for thousands of years, but also something more immediate and mysterious. The theatrical performance has demonstrated how human creativity and divine inspiration can work together to create experiences that transcend the limitations of both purely artistic and purely religious approaches to spiritual truth. Walking home through the darkening streets of Athens, you carry with you new questions about identity and authenticity, about the relationship between being and seeming, about whether the deepest truth can only be approached through forms of controlled pretense that paradoxically reveal more reality than straightforward honesty could convey. The god who wore a mask has shown you that sometimes we must become other than ourselves in order to discover who we really are.